Hello everyone, today we conclude our brief introduction to Chingizid-Yuan Mongol Chinese warfare, focusing on the unit types. We will actually focus on Mongol unit types that in many ways are sort of universal. Here the Chinese bias is relatively superficial, but that's why in fact I make multiple videos on the topic. Given that we have in fact to cover all those different Mongol unit types in detail in some dedicated videos. Of course, we already made a lot about Mongol warfare in general, but it's still somewhat introductory or it looks, generally speaking, at Mongol warfare without too much regionalism involved. I think we don't have any military historical unit video dedicated to Mongol units. We talk about the Mongolian horse, we talk about the Vafidiya, that are the sort of political exiles in the, say, Mamluk armies, mostly of Mongol origin, but not only. So we really have to get a bit, way more actually in depth into Mongol warfare as far as also unit types, arms and armor is concerned. Today we really make a very simple categorization that, however, does nail the ABC of Mongol armies unit types. We have already hinted at them in the last episode about the Yuan, when we look at the Mongols, say, laws of recruitment and the requirement as far as, in fact, the panoply is concerned. We've seen that the heavy Mongol units were to be deployed apparently on 5 ranks deep, 2 of which had to be heavily armored. And by this we mean being covered in some degree of, in fact, heavier armor than the average. Doesn't mean too much. We do not know whether, aside from this positive sources, how armored the average Mongol heavy cavalryman really was. In any case, we have touched on this topic in that video about the Western explanations of the Mongol victories, in which we see from, in fact, a European perspective what struck apparently like the authors of the time out of the sort of much more complex Mongol military machine, and this is likely the product of a knightly attention towards the peers, right, of the more heavily armored Mongol troops that evidently weren't also either the majority, right? That is the incredibly resistant Mongol armor as far as especially the frontal part of it was concerned, but also the lack of uniformity, of homogeneity as far as its construction was really concerned. This is quite interesting for a number of reasons we'll explain now. First of all, we should point out that in general there is a multitude of other descriptions of Mongol armor from also different sources, types, such as documentary or iconographic or even archaeological for that matter. The Mongols did not invent any particular type of arms and armor, right? What they used was already there, and we've seen also different videos about Eurasian steppes warfare and this Eastern one originally. The design of armor, for example, was the same. So it's the migration era from Pannonia to the Bering Strait, and it wouldn't really change for centuries and centuries. We arrive at the beginning of the 20th century. Some isolated groups out there still essentially wore this kind of armor design. There is no other course but to use a composite picture of the more reasonable types of arms and armor in order to describe them in the first place. You can imagine also, as far as local Chinese warfare in this case, how much material culture differed. This is not entirely true. The Chinese had been heavily influenced by steppe warfare and, in fact, panoply designs. But of course, there is an important material difference between China and Mongolia. And as I always like to stress, in spite of the development of the Mongol army in general and its achievements that are extraordinary to say the least, we shouldn't think that the Mongol army, that as we've seen remained in its core, essentially that ethnic nomadic one, was particularly advanced from a material point of view at all. I mean, surely those millennia of military historical culture in the steppe had produced, as we've seen, quite specifically apt type of panoply for, again, that specific context for which they had been designed. There is also a great contact with sedentary civilization. There is no doubt that from millennia the armor and arms of the steppe peoples had developed in many ways as a reaction to sedentary warfare. We've seen it, for example, with the Saka cataphract as far as the Macedonian advance up to the Sir and the defeat of the Scythians was concerned. And we should recover especially the sense of tandem, right? And especially within Eurasian warfare as a whole between these various civilizations and the same steppes. There is, however, a great deal of material poverty and primitiveness that characterizes the backbone, the numerical backbone, the average Mongol army. And as we've seen, mindset, moral forces, the cultural background is much more relevant than any specifically technological material side of the story. This must not be underestimated, but it should be understood as bent, adapted, right, subordinated to these other factors. And there is no doubt, of course, that Mongol warfare also, let's say, boomed literally in itself. If you think about the Chingizid conquests, shattering in the blast like an immense amount of population. We've seen very often how, for example, in the Middle East, there is essentially, until the 13th century, a survival even of that sort of older Iranian kind of straight type of sword and sort of more still sort of infantry type of combat significantly developed next to cavalry that was already prevalent. But with the Mongol tsunami, basically you have just sabers everywhere, these curved swords, lighter kind of and larger kind of at the same time cavalry warfare, a lot of lamellar and more. That's the reason. But we have observed this, made videos about, for example, Western Iranian warfare during more or less this period, the same Middle Eastern one, the Anatolian one, the same Ruthenian one. So there is really a lot when we keep looking at that. The Mongols also exhausted many forces throughout the 13th to 14th century. In many ways, you can see the mid-14th century crisis all across Eurasia as a sort of civilizational burnout derived from all these various as impetuous risings, right, to the top that also came together with an enormous amount of military activity in every field. There were some sort of lost and unheard of basins out there in the heart of the Asian steppes that, surprisingly, from an archaeological point of view, show us actually an incredibly advanced type of arms and armor making, of metallurgy, of, say, military science, that were at some point invested by the Mongol tide that either destroyed them and or actually got from it something. Right, just to prove that you don't have to be particularly advanced technologically, in fact, to be successful, and that still, however, you are able to adopt the best of what you find. This is typical of all great military cultures, and actually, if you are able to successfully integrate it into your system, it means that you're already sort of more advanced than that, right? Especially if you make an effective and enhanced use of the same. So there are so many different aspects of this: economicals and scientific, procurement, technological, apological points that we cannot cover just today. So today we'll make a very simple inquiry about what sort of a stereotypical average Mongol warrior would have looked like, and understanding, of course, how this different tactical specialties interacted in combined arms between one another, which is actually, it's not even the objective of the video, the last part, but it's obvious that these type of units were all part of a perfectly synergic system where everybody had a very precise role. And we know it basically for all armies existing out there, so it wasn't much of an option using this or that guy. Armies differed, but just because of some sort of broader political, social contingencies rather than the actual, randomness of their composition, more or less. In fact, again, the ethnic Mongol army, as in its nomadic core, remain always there. So going back to the heavier cavalry, at least the final rank one, and we'll look at the guards, at the elite, like the imperial forces as well. We see essentially an iron scale, perhaps lamellar shirt, being the most common or sort of sensible of the alternatives among all this evidence that we have. Naturally, we have plenty of other typologies. Chainmail shirts, we underestimate how we've seen it well in videos like the Ruthenian or Volga Bulgarian warfare, how far east actually the influence of chainmail really went. By willful desire of those who purchased it that far, ox-hide cuirasses, right, in a more economical way for slightly less armor, protected at least, warriors. Even boiled leather, that, as you know, in this century was a thing in Europe, especially in particular regions that are also very advanced metallurgically speaking. Recently made a video about central northern Italian warfare that explains that cuir bouilli role in the so-called Tasco-Angevin Provençal style. We see definitely leather reinforced with iron plates. That seems to have been the actual deal that impressed the Western knights, which is also fascinating because it's not more nor less essentially what the Brunia of the Carolingian era seems to have been made like, albeit with a different outcome under different forces. Unfortunately, we do not have a Brunia, nor we have actually much luck in fact reconstructing this organic, partly mixed, partly metal, partly organic material armor. But that sort of thickly, even very empirically put together armor, with even in very crude, primitive ways, and also very ingenious, inventive ones, is in fact difficult to trace, to properly even reconstruct, at least with a degree of authenticity. The apparently black lacquered bands of leather were a thing in this type of armor too. The Mongols, obviously, and we'll see it better later, especially for the guard units, did not make exception as far as the color, the colorful really appearance that that armor had, in also very varied ways. Black is as often associated with the Mongols, a sort of darker vision that they also owned in many ways in their conception of power, and just this set of universal references. If you look at the chronology, by the way, and consider the spread of such part metal, part leather, especially studded armor, you realize that we already entered towards the later end, in the time of the Brigandine, for example, in Europe. And so there are different solutions that at different times in history take different form, right? Even though the concept behind that is really the same. Naturally, all the types of armor that we have listed would have largely been provided on a personal, customized basis, right? It's unrealistic to pretend that even those issues of uniformation that, of course, were attempted in any army, including the Mongol one, as we've seen last time, as far as the equipment, military equipment was concerned, would fall short. And actually the reason why these laws existed was exactly the point, that there was no homogeneity, and that these were just the primitive statal attempts to sort of fix them to a degree. It was important in this regard, especially as far as the troops that were more directly controllable, to issue some provisions that would eventually be obeyed down the line with practical solutions that, of course, we are unaware of because we're dramatically undocumented. But that's mostly what happens also in a more civilized reality like China, where there is that type of administrative control from the side of the government. There is more surplus. There are sort of more standardized production, meaning they're mostly subcontracted. In fact, there were properly statal armories, but they weren't meant to provide the equipment for everyone, of course. So that also, of course, the Chinese levy would have a type of armor that, however, compared to the average, that they would customize, but compared to the average arms and armor making in the steppe, would have been likely more standardized, would have been sort of at least produced in more, say, proto-industrial fashion and distributed with more commercialization. Even though we shouldn't underestimate how organized the Mongols were in the steppes, most of the arms and armor production there was connected with, first of all, like a Mongol capacity, individual capacity to create arms and armor on their own, right? And only secondly, on a clanic, on a tribal basis, of course, organized in that way that we intend, of course, also that the Great Khan would have brought further, means under his control. There was that degree of centralization also in the steppes. But as we said at the beginning, this uniformity was not so stringent as opposed to actually just field those types of troops that would have regularly been, given their violent lifestyle, and in fact this repeated expedition, just already equipped, already knowing on this, say prefiguring what these terrible expeditions, thousands of kilometers across Eurasia, would have been useful, right? Would have served that particular task, that particular purpose, right? So whenever you find, of course, a different, say a varied, yet another diverse explanation of how Mongols were armed and armored, aside from the fact that more or less it wouldn't change in the essentials much, just know that aside from the extremes, it's absolutely normal. The average Mongol warrior had a shield, and the most normal type of structure is generally accepted to have been a wicker-backed one with a tough hide covering, which, speaking of hides, like think about the chattel, these guys literally lived and moved right together with in their entire life, including during military expeditions. So they had the simple means of making this. Think about arrows, right? We'll see them now, but any kind of weapon, like the average Mongol in the steppe would have known how to essentially create one, right? In, say, the direst of circumstances. The average cavalry lance would have been roughly 1 meter and 20 centimeters long, had a small hook below the spear blade, and was adorned with a tuft of black horse hair. This, of course, had some practical purpose as well. There was a religious meaning attached, especially to the latter aspect. And it was, as you understand, sort of versatile weapon for at least some sort of closer engagement like this. The average um, heavy cavalry would have fought with this. But of course, there were some veritable lancers that had longer spears. The idea is that the Mongols were excellent at collective training, so they weren't seeking this massive formation just to like the individual, the average Mongol to be much of an individual fighter, right, into hand-to-hand combat. They counted mostly on the maneuver and how much mass they could concentrate, taking the enemy by surprise, and just striking with that. And then, of course, the majority of the Mongol horsemen were, as you know, horse archer. Reason for which, by the way, 2 composite bows with 2 quivers, totaling 60 arrows capacity, were issued, but also for heavy cavalry. This is particularly important because in the steppes, of course, that's completely like the spirit, especially of the heavier, like aristocratic element. You never abandon the bow. There is a deep religious symbolism connected with that, and the use of this weapon is always, say, required to some extent, even by those shock forces. These heavier guys had a mace, an axe, a lasso, a sword. These weapons, as you understand, are very much anti-armor, including the lasso that is used at least to essentially unhorse a surrounded enemy, especially of the heavier type that you can't sort of ride around. Of course, like in direct hand-to-hand fighting, there's a few that you can do with that in a concrete sense, especially in a collective way. Then you have leather bags. This practice was already documented among the Liao. Keith made a video about those, and as we've seen, like these were not just Mongols, but they had been heavily Sinicized, and the young Temujin had been serving in their armor. So this heavier element, especially of the Mongol army, had the best equipment and was meant to be very flexible, as you understand, very adaptable, very multifunctional. It wasn't just a shock force; there was some greater flexibility and capacity that would have been also necessary in contexts in which actually the enemy would have been heavier than them, if we talk about the sedentary foes. And of course, there are smaller engagements in which you have, in virtue of this difference, like to adapt a bit more individually elastic, depending on the situation. We tend to underestimate this aspect. Yes, the Mongols had, like this is typical of steppes, peoples of very narrow elite that, however, is very elite. It's even heavier to some extent than the one of the sedentary world, but it's so narrow. And the actually average heavy cavalryman is overall not that heavy compared to, for example, a much more uniformly, especially by the 13th century, for example, mounted elite in Western Europe, right? So that's an important difference with medieval knights of Europe, because these were armed and armored more or less in all the same way, right? The Mongol equivalent kind of wasn't, right? We can't say really equivalent because, as we've just said, like the Mongol equivalent does not exist. It's not a European army. Let's say the heavier element, what within the Mongol system is a heavier element, is on average lighter than that sort of much more also civilizationally homogenized Western Europe. We always think as if, I don't know, Europe was hopelessly fragmented in a way that, especially the modernistic interpretations, stress as dysfunctional or whatever. No, it was an incredibly interconnected, homogeneous and osmotic fluid system for which you have literally arms and armor evolving in the same ways within the span of some years, practically all over the West, like, and we can trace it in a very detailed way in terms of arms and armor, and especially by the end of the 13th century, as I was saying before, basically all cavalry, also what say squires once back in the day, or servientes, sergeants, have made videos about this, especially for the Crusades series, were becoming virtually indistinguishable in terms of arms and armor from the men-at-arms, but by the master, which is a standard that is maintained actually until the mid-14th century crisis, after which there is a further havening of the men-at-arms to the point that the others can't keep up with that, and they specialize into other tactical roles, auxiliary roles, but up to that point, the balance had been maintained. As you understand here, the Mongol armies do not look, especially in the eyes of the Europeans, as something particularly homogeneous within the same. Right? They would have sort of, again, virtually been. It's not like the Mongol army was just a mass of sort of, even if when they, as we've seen, they sent in, especially as sort of expendable troops to be sacrificed against the enemy missiles, some subject people, some were slave, prisoner, whatever. They were still coming more or less from the same nomadic pool that didn't have many options of how you could be equipped. Just the manufacture, the production, the distribution was less sophisticated, less developed, and in fact homogeneous than, say, in the West or in China, like in this case. So, the first and paramount mark of the Mongol, in many ways, was the presence of two red ribbon streamers of almost half a meter long attached to his helmet or hat and hung down the back. These had all specific religious meanings. These, I think, are the same references that came later as the Om and the Ah and the in Buddhism, that you can find in at least one of the historical Mongolian flags. Then, of course, at this time, there wasn't sort of mainstream Buddhist background. But they have to do with the completion of the universe and the capacity. We were just talking about it yesterday with by the way, the Chinese tradition as far as the transcendence of the ruler, so he who actually owns the imperium in conforming to the higher divine perfection. So, of course, there was a religious relevance attached, especially to the the heavier element, to those who really felt the most this sort of dragon-like struggle, right, towards the sun and heaven, and this is also a symbol shared with the griffin, for example, in the West. There would be, of course, all different kind of colors for the military dress, right? And we will be more specific in other videos, but we really do find lots of different colors expectedly from different types of sources, and so we unfortunately don't have a video footage of a Mongol army in action from the 13th or the 14th century. We see gray or bright blue for trousers. Consider all the environmental issues, like the steppe is an incredibly tough place to be. Winter, sheepskin or wool-lined trousers were substituted. So of course the Mongols knew how very well, were aware of the thermic excursions during night and day, by the way, depending also on where, because the steppes are incredibly vast, but also especially during the course of the year. And they knew obviously how to dose those energies to a point that also an internally adequate temperature to be military performing was allowed. It would be the kalat, a long white tunic. It's usually represented as blue or brown. Relatively somber colors appear in general. Of course, the average Mongol didn't have much dyes available, just for the fancy of it. It would just be more concerned with surviving, rather. But it's obvious that if you look at these heavier guys, and especially the wealthy nobility, the calottes would be decorated with plush trim on collars, borders, hems, and cuffs. We're not talking about silk. And considering the Chinese background, there, that silk is also very effective as far as made anti-bullet armor today as well. With that, the Japanese knights had some sort of balloons being behind the back, like filled by the wind as they were riding, to prevent, especially during escapes. There were horse archers there as well. Yeah, like bad hits from the back. Then soiled silk robes would be there, obviously. Also captured in plunder. We've seen in the previous episodes about Chingizid-Yuan warfare how, of course, there is this passage from the steppe conqueror to the literal seizing of this enormous, to say the least, Chinese treasures. So you can imagine at that point all kind of combinations and massive Chinese influence after the conquest in styles and varieties that doesn't make much even sense to try to summarize here. Then leather boots, typical for riders, without heels, but with many laces. Then the most typical headgear wouldn't even be a helmet necessarily, even for the heavier type of cavalry. And I used some of these hats, like here, to some reconstructions in the images. Were essentially conical caps made of quilted material with a turned up brim and ear flaps, and decorated with fox or wolf fur just to make it more comfortable. And the Mongols were particularly obsessed with fur, given that in their system showed a veritable hierarchy of status. To different furs corresponded a different social condition. This is true for all steppe peoples. And you understand how important it would be ethnically also for these oceanic rulers that now had taken over the world, in their view. So again, the noblemen would tend to use sort of more expensive or even exotic type of furs, such as wolf, fox, badger, and even monkey. And this order is actually the one that of importance, and the monkey there also was connected, in fact, with this sort of subjugated south of Indochina, as we've seen, that was not, say, was savager even in their own view, especially after they had taken over the entire China. Whereas the lower estates of the Mongol warriors would wear dog and goat fur, which tells you also how limited and miserable their material culture really was. Remember what Western ambassadors / spies / missionaries referred to the Western courts when they said how these Mongols lived like, right? Even what the great Khan ate would have disgusted a medieval French peasant, that after all, in the bigger scale of things in the globe, wasn't faring that poorly. As we've seen, there could be different types of armor, from black lacquered leather bands to scale armor of some kind. A heavier Mongol cavalryman would also use javelins, sometimes in substitution of the lance proper. Remember what we were saying before, that these guys weren't at large searching for a dramatic hand-to-hand kind of engagement. Javelins were good because they offered some interesting armor penetration, but still allowed like just these guys to throw him from a safe enough distance that their armor had contributed to reduce, still pulling out, right, retreating. And so we've seen, for example, the suicide forces that had literally lure the enemy in the center, right, refusing it and retreating, and we've seen that these were actually elite forces that would act as a sort of skirmishers. And for running more, for being chased more effectively, these Mangudais, this was their name, would have unarmored horses. It sort of makes a lot of sense. These were the chase of the army. It wasn't like the bad expandable stuff that was properly in the fore of this and would be often massacred. Before these guys would be in fact met by the enemy, also because the horse archers' wings would have opened when this would charge, if they were especially like heavier ones. And so these suicide troops were, because it was extremely risky just to pull out in that situation, somebody would have always been left behind, right? But for this reason they had to be geared to be as fast as possible. By the way, speaking of the military dress, you have to imagine, of course, of all the possible, and unfortunately we're not very documented about that, but say divides, say recognition, symbols that denoted this or that tribe. This was particularly the case for headgear, as we've seen. For example, the Derbet and Urian-khai allies wore hats with a thick rim and round flat top. There was all a code, a system of recognition that no Mongol had to be simply, say that they would have simply recognized by being raised as Mongols in the steppes, right? But that to them, of course, was that crucial and vital and important, as opposed to, say, the Chinese subjects that barely would recognize at least these details in difference. The Tanguts employed a cylindrical cap, apparently. Now, at the end of the 14th century, the Persian author Muhammad Siya Kalam represented in some sort of allegorical, symbolical way some Mongols, and he, again, their appearance would have changed much less, also representing this ethnic way, compared to, say, what Europeans would have looked like in armor and military clothes. And these paintings show some tribal headgear that were associated to different groups within the Mongol nation. However, we're not told how they were called. We see again different colors of them. In this case, these are illuminations: black with light blue trim, gold, black with red trim, gold, black. So of course, color, as we were saying before, was yet another very specific indicator. The Khalats had collars and borders faced with different colors. The blue Khalats are faced red, brown ones are faced light blue, and the black Khalats are faced red. So what would have a Mongol Khan really look like from a military point of view? We have a description about the same Genghis Khan. He was 56, and we're told they mounted on a white horse, of course symbolizing fully transfigured heavenly power, wearing a white felt hat adorned with eagle feathers. Same meaning. In the universe, you can argue. So this is really not just the oceanic, but the heavenly ruler, right? The ocean was the one over which he was floating, commanding and directing the tidal waves of. And of course, as any respectable Mongol, to say the least, he had to wear the red streamers, the red stripes. Interestingly enough, however, it was a long black sable coat trimmed with plush. It was very sort of, expansive, clothes with a girdle of golden plates. In fact, his attire is really magnificent, and there is a simplicity in it. I mean, other Mongols would have had just perhaps less straightforward heavenly symbolism, but also very lavish, luxurious appearance as well. By the way, in this description, Chingizid Khan is wearing madder-colored boots, which also was a finesse. We should also look at the physical appearance of this man. There is one aspect, right, that actually connects with that video that I made on, say, the appearance of the ancient Romans as a response to Metatron. People always go watching still. That is, what did like a Mongol leader look like, right? I will not say that there is this story that Chingizid Khan actually had reddish hair and blue-green eyes of some sort, as his father Yesugai. This is debatable historically, but it shouldn't, but not because of the obvious fact. That's the point I was making. That yes, there could be, especially at the higher levels of Mongol hierarchy, some sort of greater international connection and selection. The Mongols had historically been confined to very narrow parts of the steppes at the time of the Indo-European peak of dominance of the same. There are still today lots, say, of there are some Mongols today that are actually fair-haired and eyed. Like, it's fairly rare, to say the least. But this is a bit like among some, say, namely Turkic populations, for example. Just the most banal example that is also readily explained in a general, say, statistical sense, the Tatars, right? We say the Tatars, but they're saying we connect them to the mostly to the Turks that dominated politically and ethnically the steppes by the time this ethnogenesis had occurred. But in fact, in places that are not just west of the Urals or just next to them to the other side, but in fact were filled with Indo-European ancestry. There are lots of even red hair properly recorded by the same Chinese among these populations, especially of Central Asia. Well, there we know that there were some specific Indo-European peoples, but still today certain haplogroups connecting with those characters are pretty scattered, also in places like the Volga Valley, for example, among populations that, aside from all like the deportations, the massacres, etc., in more recent centuries, and that in fact made largely these peoples undistinguishable in an ethnic sense. I mean, they're not documented, they're transformations. Like, some people say we are the descendants of this group, but actually they actually weren't. It's sort of moving to an extent, but this cannot erase, of course, the presence of fairer types that are not even. It's not because, I don't know, the Slavs eventually conquered this in Tsarist times, etc. It is really connected with the presence of Indo-Europeans very close to, like, very like in Far East Asia. We have we know, like, think about how the chariot culture arrived up to China, and some, maybe the founders of the Chinese Empire, we say it always might have been Indo-Europeans themselves. So you may never know, especially at this higher level. By the way, Chingizid Khan's mother was a Nestorian Christian, which doesn't mean much. I mean, it's not ethnically related, but of course, like, the connections abroad. This were Nestorian Christians, by the way. There were Muslims, right? But the sense is that there would have been a sort of long-ranged kind of connection. Still, those Apollonian heavenly symbols, also connected with those ancient rulers of the steppes, would have been praised, right? And it is possible that Chingizid Khan had these traits regardless of sort of the legion, what he actually would have looked like or not. We can see one aspect that when Kublai Khan, the future Khan Kublai, was born, a great deal was made of the fact that he was of dark complexion, which means that, at least on average, the average Mongol would have not been. Naturally, it doesn't mean much because, say, many Asians are not dark, right? They're actually pretty pale, right? Which doesn't mean white in the sense we intended it, white Caucasian sense, right? And phenotype and genotypes are slightly different. They can connect in different ways, but that is also to be noticed. That otherwise, I mean, if that had been common among the Mongols just per se, or with something that they didn't want to notice as something, say, relevantly exceptional, they would have not cared. So these crossbreedings across the steppes are incredibly fascinating. And by the way, consider what the Mongols did with all the people that they raided, they kidnapped, they took prisoners from the most faraway places. Do you think that some Pole or Czech was not taken by the Mongols back to the Karakoram? Like that is an actual thing. After all, we know that there were Alanian bodyguards that would have been acquired in a different way, apparently at least, among the Yuan emperor's court. So this is to be much appreciated when you think about the cosmopolitan nature of this truly oceanic, universal, ecumenic rule. An element of the Mongol officers' rank and equipment as a whole were some so-called tablets of authority that were bestowed upon commanders of the larger units, right? And in growing order here, we have the Commander 100 that had a silver tablet weighing 120 saggi. Consider that a saggi was equivalent to 1/6 of an ounce, or 74 grains troy, which in this case would have weighed over 500 grams. To a commander of 10,000 men, that a golden tablet weighing 220 saggi was provided. So in this case, we're talking about essentially 1 kilo of gold. And consider this like in terms of just, this is typical of the steppe, by the way, boasting every kind of wealth that you have, because you carry it with you fundamentally when you move. And so automatically somebody can understand what's your status, say how relevant you are, and so how they have to deal with you, right? It's how more likely you are to have a following, so either to join it and not to mess with it. So this is incredibly important. A commander of the 100,000, so here we're talking about, of course, like men that would not actually command 100,000 men, because that would have been really impossible for the armies. This kind had a tablet of gold of 300 saggi, that is to say, almost 1 kilo and a half. And interestingly enough, this bore the symbols of the sun, the moon, and the lion. On the aforementioned 10,000, only the lion's head was stamped. So here, the symbolism fundamentally is obvious, like the lion itself expressing courage, but also like this battling warrior is sort of the becoming that we've seen in Saint tradition. Here there is still a becoming, because this guy, of course, is not God, is not even a great Khan in that sense, but there is a sun and the moon. There is a completion of, let's say, the part of the word strength that, of course, the Mongols see amplified within these 100,000 men of theirs as the chosen race to rule over the globe. And so there is almost a cosmic balance that starts here to be weighed and balanced, and that must be maintained. Remember what we said yesterday just in the video about the Chinese tradition, how difficult it is to stay in the virtue, not to be shattered by both sides. Here the sun and the moon are a bit like the yin and the yang, the wei and the wu wei, which means acting and not acting, like meaning giving simply an order will making this 100,000 part of the world forces moving just because of your capacity, in fact, to interact with the cosmos. Another tablet of authority was passed out over the Prince of the Realm. This also weighed 300 saggi and it was in gold. A bird that figured on the early Mongol standards, symbolizing power, royalty, and freedom. That essentially is connected here to the literal idea that being just the Prince of the Realm, it's on the hair of the great Khan, is as if like we're a part of himself, like his own falcon that is simply left out there in heaven, and for this force like go prey on earth and bringing back like this, of course, dispensing this divine breath and coming back always to the master. It's a beautiful view of how like a Mongol prince would be conceived in this imperial idea. And you see, of course, like the golden badge is always like and in fact there is a golden parasol in miniature, though, issued to a commander of above 100,000 men. And these people were so important that they had the authorization to sit on a silver chair in the presence of the Khan that naturally had the golden throne, and it symbolized that true, absolute, sacred royal purity. But the golden parasol was almost like saying, okay, I will sit next to the Khan and I will use this to literally to not to be burnt by the greatness of the sun that this guy represents. This symbolism is fascinating, and it's connected, of course, also with further Mongol military iconography from the battle standards. The tuk is the most famous yak tail banner, was literally 9 yak tails put together, usually white but not only, representing the Khan, right? The compaction of all these this hair that made one pure block of force that would eventually remain always in the same order in spite of flowing in the wind and being shattered by these heavenly cosmic thunderstorms that shattered the world but not the Khan. The composition of arrangement of the tails could vary. In 1256, Nayan, a Mongol leader and not first but cousin of Kublai Khan, but still rebelled against the latter. Nayan was the son of Agul of the line of Uchagin, that was Temujin brothers. They were by this point like a very low-ranking clan lineage, and yet, right, this guy took action against the emperor. We don't know, by the way, whether he descended from Temuge, that was Genghis Khan's youngest full brother, or Bulgutai, his half-brother. This is relevant because, as we've seen, Genghis Khan's mother was Christian. So you understand, however, that Nestorianism was around. Consider that during the Pax Mongolica it was plenty, but I mean plenty of Europeans in China, mostly Dominicans, Franciscans, this kind of communities, but also lots of other people. So the influences there were relevant. Here, Nayan is an interesting figure, even in his relatively minor role, right? But it's also fascinating, of course, to think how many religions were allowed in the Mongol army as well, or like it was in a form like of modern, what we call tolerance, right? Because these were tolerated exactly because it would have been better actually to have a unique belief, but an empire this size could not do without the subjects' religion that could not be eradicated. That simply so the same Genghis Khan, as you know, had been open, possibilist, let's say, about different options for just the political guidance. We'll talk about it in another video, if anything. It was said, by the way, that Kublai Khan was, speaking of Nayan here, was also very sensitive to Christianity, specifically. And some say it could have been converted. That's the great dream of the Westerners, to make the great Mongol European Christian crusade against the Muslims. In the West, naturally, things went very differently, but still, these relations existed and they were quite important, right? We know also that no religious edifice was destroyed, at least purposely, by governmental order, nor priests were mistreated. Consider that there was a big deal of disciplinary control to be issued by the Khans. Like there was this, yes, ferocious discipline because the Khans were that effective. These are cultures in which, again, if you screw up, you're dead anyway, right? You're just not worthy enough down the ranks to simply have an opinion on that. There is actually an incredibly heavy sense of autocratic despotism from in the steppes that is further reinforced by the yesterday mentioned Chinese authoritarianism, to say the least, is incredibly strong. It's something completely different from what we had in Europe, even in a, say, fully traditional caste-based society, like the one of the estates. However, that is important as well. I mean, it speaks of the plus and minuses, the pros and cons, the limits and the absence of it in the Mongol system, and it must be understood how it worked. Now, the wide majority of Mongol forces would be, of course, composed by horse archers. Now, today, in theory, we talk about China, right? So we explained yesterday that, of course, we are describing just the Mongol army per se, and that essentially parts of this were grafted on the Chinese style of administration to be sustained and employed. And that fundamentally, yes, the Mongols fought with their core of ethnic forces, and that would be lots of other auxiliaries from levies from the same China, subjects from different peoples. Would be plenty of of course, foreign princes cooptation. Think about all the tributary states, etc. That's sort of a complicated story, and it's easier to look at the warfare of the single peoples there rather than making it through this Mongol despotic control. However, there is one aspect that remains true also within the hierarchy of the same Mongol people, and the one that this had with, let's say, in fact, with other subjugated Mongol populations as well as other akin ones to them. It's the idea that the average Mongol horse archer was essentially an auxiliary of some sort, right? Explain myself better. Of course, like the Mongols had in especially this great noblemen and clansmen participating to Genghis Khan's conquests as free Mongols, let's say, and always, however, subjected to some degree to this greater ruler by, again, cosmic law, and so less relevant in terms of individual liberty. That is a thing, right? So the idea of freemen has been really abused in the historical discourse, both in a, say, physical and metaphysical way. But there would be lots of peoples all over the steppes that would be invested by the Mongol tide, and that were also particularly similar to them in warfare, and that would serve these as subjects to the Oceanic ruler, but often being despoiled, being beheaded of their elite. Right. So when you look at all these horse archers in the steppes, it's because these people are weaker. Right. The light element alone does not defeat the heavy one. So these guys are actually subjected. It's a bit like, say, I don't know, the knight and the servant, the knight and the squire. Right. There is a difference initially that is also technical, practical. Right. That reveals that level of personal subordination. Considering the swarms of horse archers that the Mongols ruled over, you have to consider that these, one or another, were some sort of auxiliary force, some sort of even paramilitary one. You see, they didn't, for example, fight in ranks. They fight in say, open order, say, loose formation, and they are, in this sense, supposed to follow. There is a tight discipline, but it mostly derives from this clientary subjection that at times could be internal to the Mongol people. That was, of course, at the highest of the, at least, ethnic hierarchy. But that was sometimes probably like the product of a people being essentially annihilated politically. In the steppe, it's sort of like the remnants of following along, like the Mongol army, just to get their loot and pretty much it. And these people would roam the steppes, serving not just the Mongols, by the way, and God knows how far they would get, right? But it's they're some sort of auxiliary component. Then, of course, again, there is the more regular component of these forces coming from probably the Mongol nobility that fought with heavies, but also with their lighter elements of their tribes. There is a beautiful source, the Moko Shurai e-kotobe, dating to 1293. This is the famous Mongol invasion scroll made in Japan and attributed authorally to Tosa Nagataka and Tosa Nagaki. I used this also in the pictures. We already, I don't remember from which video we talk about it as an evidence, and the interesting aspect of the auxiliary archers that are shown in here is that they're not Mongol, but actually Chinese, right? And this also makes a lot of sense. China had levies, had local militias, and more regular forces, but of course there was a sort of a wilder part of the Chinese frontier that had also been quite invested by Mongol forces, in which, of course, the state and the same public authority was much more degraded. That were some sort of more warlike forces, always subject, always on foot, so not having much of a chance, but still being up to a fight. In this source, we see a quiver of leopard skin trimmed with black, a buff-colored coat, white trousers, black boots, and yellow metal helmets. Again, also a helmet. Every armor was painted. We see also how colorful this could be just an artistic license for that matter, but it's real. Like, especially if you look at some Chinese auxiliaries, they may have actually been supplied with a minimal of clothes color uniformity, which would normally happen through the normal Chinese supplies provision that gave to, at this point, some sort of professional troopers, rather, like some already dyed piece of clothes that eventually they would have to arrange for themselves during the campaign. In any case, this would have been worn out after just a couple of months. The interesting thing here is, of course, like the variety of colors and the art, the detail as well. The hair shape near the ears is actually part of the helmet. that was, as we've seen, painted as well. It's not warrior hair. There are not just archers, but spearmen. There would have been other types of troops, but this would have been sort of more common to an extent, especially from the more frontier areas. At least the spearman is quite universal, but the Chinese had also crossbows, for example, of different, say, performance, say, capacities. And the spearmen are again, these are Chinese, and they're showed with the same element of the archers. However, their coat is green, and they also carry a shield and 1 meter and 70-80 centimeters long javelins. This aspect is also interesting because it shows that these auxiliary forces are somehow provided even in what should be like a heavy infantry element, like in this case, with a missile capacity, which doesn't speak much about the heaviness of this, but also highlights how, say, the same Chinese warfare had become a bit more multitask because of Mongol influence in this greater sense of volatility of, say, more courageous infantry formations that did exist, but especially after the Mongol conquest, and of course the country was shattered. There had been, as we've seen, massive baths of blood of the Jin as well as the Song, and so the Mongols are using these as true subjects, as true, vanquished people, and they equip them in a way that sort of can compromise with the way of war or not. I say this because in the West you don't find like this typical spearmen equipped with javelins by the 13th to 14th century, unless you're talking about the Celtic fringe or Eastern Europe, right? Western warfare does not have that. It's much more courageously compact, all right? In javelins, you find them at best in siege warfare, not in open field. This, again, always reflect on this sort of comparative side of the story, and especially never think that the West was less developed or anything, that the Mongol victories in Europe actually have anything to do with the ability. I made an entire video about that. People tend to watch frequently, with conquering the entire continent, especially the most developed part of it. So it's it is all expressed in part by these indicators, right? Then, as we explained last time, as far as the Mongol drill and orders signal system was concerned, there was the huge Mongol kettle drum, the great Nakara of the camp. This was practically a huge drum that was meant to properly direct the entire army. I explained how essentially the drums are very much connected with every type of warfare where there are lots of horse archers. We know this from in the Middle East since our Sassanid times and before. Aside from the divine symbolism of their music, I explained this in the video about Islamic military music. There are some things about the Khwarezmians that blow your mind, by the way, annihilated by the Mongols in this sense. Considering the emperor as, say, the ruler as divine as the music and the drum itself that was carried by an actual triumphal chariot with all the subject princes hostage at the court of the Khwarezmian ruler that had to play smaller drums of gold, right? The bigger one was of gold. And the reason is in part the fact that all those horse archers, as we've seen, they're not in a battle line. They are at least they get disordered. They don't follow a specific rank and file order while engaged. They are to be directed in this enormously tumultuous whirlwinds of of horses and dust, etc., by this sound that it would have been to be heard very far away. I had the privilege of studying certain Western European battles, or at least Central European battles, that actually showed how, by say the 13th century, the same times, there was an equivalent of this. Right? This is not just an Eastern thing. Most people associate this, as it is true, like for the development of modern military instrumental, say, musical instruments, the Ottoman influence that stemmed from this, by the way. But probably it's a very overlooked aspect also in Western warfare. There was a lot of that, much more than we're prone to think. It is true that these military bands weren't that, military musical bands weren't that sort of as regulated and organized as, say, the Ottoman ones. I made a video about that, by the way. But they were there, and they were necessary a bit for the same reason, ordering the troops in general, right? The say 2 kettle drums were of the great Nakara were carried because the Nakara is the band, right? Then eventually today it's the name of an instrument as well, but it's another thing. They were carried by a Bactrian camel since the time of Genghis Khan. The drum was a symbol of power in itself. If you received it, this is especially true in Islam, there was all hierarchy connected with this recognition of sort of transcendental power wielding that in Islam, especially because of the prohibition to represent, to figure, to like to concretize like a divine image, you essentially just express this this power of harmony instead. And the drum roll of the great Nakara among the Mongols was only used to signal the charge of the entire army, which was, of course, like a moment in which the Dionysian forces that the drum sort of evokes, differently from the trumpets, that are much more Apollonian and best suited for at least heavy cavalry charges, but here mostly they are the subjects, as we've seen, from the chthonic element and sort of disorder, the horse archers. Also overlapped with, okay, that's the signal for assault, and as we've seen in the previous video, all these men began to shout in the most savage ways that would horrify any listener. We're talking about huge masses of men. Just think about also this with the clopping of the, sometimes in like really tens and tens of thousands of horses at a time. Speaking of horse armor, before we actually in the last video we talked about the aforementioned necessity of those first 2 ranks of the Mongol heavy cavalry to be armored also in the mounts. There is a debate of some sort, at least we will see it better in a better dedicated video on the Mongolian horse, of how, let's say, iron was used compared to, for example, lacquered leather, also for the horse. It would have been actually homogeneous between the rider and the horse. Not necessarily in the sense that the entire horse would have been, say, clad like in the armor, but differently from the West, where actually at this time you start seeing full barded metal caparisons that are very rare anyway. There are half ones as well, aside from the chamfron that is plate armor, etc. The steppe riders, you see it up to Hungary in the 12th century, had some sort of plate in the chest, etc. And so we don't understand, because there was much more horse archery, and so they didn't want the horse to be punctured. And of course also the smash was important, but say if the Westerners that were the champions of smashing did not use much of that, this is not, say, it's a bit like the cataphract. It's a lot about an environment like the steppe one, where arrows are gonna rain like hail, right? In combat, and so horses are very resilient, but they are very easily crippled as well. So you want to at least have frontally that level of protection. That is always good, and this is for some elite horsemen of sort. The point is, as we were saying before, however, the true elite has also very robust armor, like lamellar top, like we'll see it also in the various differences in barding protection in the historical unit series. But the average heavy, like, would have ideally in this 2/5 been equipped with this sort of chest chamfer or something. And we do not know exactly what would prevail, though, because it seems like from the same Western sources, descriptions of this tough, so among the toughest, presumably, Mongol armor that wasn't evidently used by the majority of the Mongol horsemen, how in fact resistant it was, effective it was, by being mostly of organic material, apparently. And so, yes, of course, we have battle descriptions of Mongol armored cavalry in action, either telling of shiny metal frontal armor, black and lacquered leather. But again, it's always difficult to simply measure this all, and it seems that the majority, of course, of these troops would have been sort of lighter than I think. We know, by the way, that the Great Khan personal guard counted 1,000 men, all mounted upon black horses, which sort of stressed the dark forces evoked from the bowels of Mongolia in the most terrifying way that the leader alone on a white horse, as we've seen, could simply tame alone, just to stress the force of this guy. It's a very effective mean. But just think about being a Chinese subject and realizing that symbolism that of course existed also in China before, and it's incredibly contrasting and showing that imperial force. And Genghis Khan's shock divisions, we don't know what are the two meant exactly. We'll talk better about Mongol army organization in another video. Had all the armor and trappings painted either red or black. Right. This is also yet another indicator, as we were saying before, of like a vivid force plus black, contrasting in a bit of a terrifying way with that symbol of universal completion, and or like it's possible annihilation, definitely the capacity that this man had of causing it. So this is part of it. As you understood, I inserted here and there some source that is more Chinese, but for the rest we rely heavily on what we know about in general about the Mongol armies, because they were fundamentally the same, right, throughout the picture. We've seen them at times for Persia, we will see it for other areas, but the essence of Mongol warfare in many ways would remain the same, would change slightly, let's say in the elite, because of the advancement of panoplies of technology over the centuries, but the essentials and also the general type of warfare would fundamentally remain the same until the Westerners took over the steppe. And China had also, in fact, developed in different ways because of it remained China, regardless of the Yuan dynasty and the later ones. So, again, we've made something so far about Mongol warfare that I'm starting to be, of course, never satisfied of, but still pleased by in the mass, because it's all these different aspects of the same that you can appreciate the more you enter into the depths, the details, the problems. The playlist does not have too many views, but we have 20 videos about Mongol warfare, which is not even entirely one about the Mongols in general. And so, especially from a couple of years ago, we started making more, right? And I'm very glad about this. Hopefully, continue. There is always some Mongol warfare, but it pops out and it's pops up and sort of is shared and in this universe. Yeah. Yes, we really need. I made the Urian heavy cavalryman. That was one of the units. Yeah. Should re-upload that. It's so old. 5 years ago. Right, these were among the first ones I made. Yeah. Should definitely remake it to some extent. But the last ones weren't bad. Actually, I'm glad that we are adding also the Chinese side of the story. And again, so many peoples to cover, so many details. Sometimes it's really crazy, but let's go on with that. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.